Richard has revealed to Good Morning Britain that he's had successful treatment for prostate cancer. The 85-year-old music legend got the diagnosis, he says, during health checks for his latest tour.
Some voices feel like home, and his was one of them. For more than 60 years, Cliff Richard was the soundtrack to British Christmas mornings, sunny summer holidays, slow car rides with your parents, and quiet kitchen radios humming in the background of ordinary life. But the man we are about to meet today is not the same anymore. At 85 years old, Cliff Richard is fighting battles most fans cannot even imagine. And what we found out about how he is really living right now will sit heavily on your chest for days. The shocking truth about his health today. If you tuned into Good Morning Britain on the 15th of December last year, you witnessed something that nobody in the studio audience was emotionally prepared for. Cliff Richard sat under those harsh studio lights, looking smaller than he used to look, and quietly told the whole world that he had been carrying a heavy secret for over a year. That secret was prostate cancer. He had not told the public. He had not told most of his close friends. He had simply kept singing, kept smiling for the cameras, kept showing up at concert venues like absolutely nothing was wrong, while doctors worked on him behind closed doors and his team protected the news with everything they had. The way he actually found out about the cancer is the part that should make every single man watching this video pay close attention. He had no symptoms at all. He had no warning signs. He was not even worried about his health at the time. The only reason the cancer was caught is because his promoter needed insurance paperwork for the upcoming tour of Australia and New Zealand. That insurance paperwork required a full medical checkup before the policy could be signed. The checkup found the disease. If Cliff had not been planning that particular tour at that particular moment, the cancer would have kept silently growing inside his body without anyone in the world knowing about it. Cliff sat there on Good Morning Britain and told the studio that the cancer is gone for the moment, but he could not bring himself to use words like cured or beaten. He said that nobody can tell those sorts of things, and you could hear in his soft voice that he meant every single syllable of what he said. Then he leaned forward slightly and said something that landed in living rooms across the country like a hammer to the chest. He said that men need to be seen as human beings who may actually die of this thing. He said all of us deserve the same ability to get tested early and start proper treatment early. The pain in his voice was real because the warning came from someone who knew how close he had come to a very different outcome. Here is the part that broke a lot of hearts watching that interview. Cliff is now actively campaigning alongside King Charles III to push for national prostate cancer screening across the whole of Britain. The UK National Screening Committee released a recommendation in late November of last year, and right now the screening proposal only covers men aged 45 to 61 who carry very specific gene variants. Cliff called this enormous gap completely absurd, and you could feel the anger in his old and tired voice. He is fighting for other men because he knows that a routine pre-tour insurance check might have saved his own life, and he wants every man in Britain to be given that same kind of lifeline that fame and money handed to him by accident. But the cancer he is fighting today is only one piece of what Cliff Richard is quietly carrying inside him, and what happened to him over a decade ago left a much deeper scar than any disease ever could. The day his world collapsed on live television. In August of 2014, Cliff was on holiday in Portugal, sitting peacefully in his apartment far from home, when he flipped on the television and saw something that did not make any sense to him at first glance. A helicopter was hovering over a building in Berkshire. Police officers in uniform were walking in and out of the front door. News cameras were zooming in on the windows. And then, with a slow and sickening realization, he understood that the building on his television screen was his own home being searched in real time. Nobody had warned him about any of it. He learned that the police were searching through his private apartment the exact same way millions of complete strangers learned it, through live BBC coverage broadcast from a helicopter high in the sky. Imagine for a moment sitting thousands of miles away from your own home, watching uniformed strangers walking through your bedroom on national television, while you have absolutely no idea why any of this is happening to you. That is exactly what Cliff Richard lived through that morning, alone in a holiday apartment, with no friend or family member beside him. The allegation behind the police raid went back nearly 30 years to a Billy Graham religious crusade held at the Bramall Lane Football Stadium in Sheffield during the summer of 1985. A man had eventually come forward claiming that Cliff had assaulted him there as a young boy. Cliff denied the claim the moment he was told about it, and he never once wavered for a single second across the next 2 years of investigation. The probe dragged on and on. The headlines kept coming week after week. The whispers in pubs and on radio shows kept growing louder. And then, in June of 2016, the Crown Prosecution Service finally made its decision and announced there was not enough evidence to bring any charges at all. Cliff was never arrested. He was never charged with anything. The whole 22-month nightmare quietly collapsed into nothing at all. But the damage was already done by then, and the man who walked away from the investigation was not the same man who had watched that helicopter footage from a hotel in Portugal. Cliff later told the court that he had contracted shingles from the stress of those long months. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose at his age. He had stopped sleeping properly for weeks on end. He testified that he sometimes looked into his own bathroom mirror and felt as if a much older stranger was looking back at him from the glass. He used a phrase in court that still hits hard when you read it on paper today. He said he felt tainted, violated, and betrayed. Those 3 small words from a man who had spent 6 decades being polite and gentle in public should tell you exactly how deep the wound truly went. What happened next inside a quiet London courtroom changed British law forever, and most people outside legal circles still have absolutely no idea how big a deal it really was. How one broken man changed Britain forever. In July of 2018, a judge named Mr. Justice Mann sat down in the Chancery Division of the High Court of England and Wales and delivered a ruling that lawyers across the entire country are still quoting today in their submissions. He found that the BBC had invaded Cliff Richard's privacy rights in a serious and sensationalist way. He awarded Cliff £190,000 in general damages and another £20,000 in aggravated damages on top of that. The aggravated portion was added specifically because the BBC had submitted that helicopter footage for a prestigious Royal Television Society award called Scoop of the Year. Just think about that for a second. Imagine breaking a man's entire life and then turning around and trying to win a shiny trophy for the act of breaking him. The total damages came to £210,000, split between the BBC and the South Yorkshire Police on a 65% and 35% basis. South Yorkshire Police had already paid Cliff £400,000 in a completely separate settlement before the BBC case even reached the courtroom. The BBC eventually ended up paying around £850,000 towards Cliff's enormous legal fees on top of the damages, which brought their total bill up to roughly £2 million in the end. Cliff himself had spent £3.4 million of his own personal money to fight the case all the way through. Here is the part of the story that absolutely nobody talks about enough on television. The judgment that Mr. Justice Mann handed down established something brand new in British law that day. It said that, as a general principle, a suspect being investigated by the police has a reasonable expectation of privacy until the moment they are charged. That single sentence has completely changed how every newsroom in Britain handles celebrity investigations ever since the day it was written. Today, when police forces are asked by journalists whether they are looking into a famous person, they routinely refuse to confirm or name names until actual charges have been filed. That kind of legal protection did not exist for ordinary citizens before Cliff Richard's case reached the courtroom. He created it with his pain and his money. But while the courts of England were busy protecting his battered reputation, something far more personal had already been stolen from him long ago, and it goes all the way back to a strange choice he made when he was still only 21 years old. The love letter that explains everything. In October of 1961, a very young Cliff sat down to write a heartbreaking letter to an Australian dancer he had been quietly seeing called Delia Wicks. That letter only became public knowledge after Delia passed away in 2010. And when people finally read the words on the page, they suddenly understood Cliff Richard in a way that they never really had before. He wrote in the letter that being a pop singer meant he had to give up one priceless thing for his career, and that priceless thing was the right to any lasting relationship with any special girl. He was only 21 years old when he wrote those particular words to her. He was choosing pure loneliness for himself before he had even properly tasted what real love could feel like. Then there was Olivia Newton-John, the woman who probably came closest of all to changing his mind about love. They met in 1971 when she became a regular guest singer on his BBC variety show. They duetted on the soft ballad called Suddenly for the soundtrack of her famous film Xanadu. They appeared together in television specials pretending to be a married couple, singing When I'm 64 together, just for the laughs. He admitted years later that he had been in love with her during those early television years, but she was already engaged to somebody else at the time. He said softly in interviews that he had lost the chance with her. 3 small words that contain a whole lifetime of quiet regret folded inside them. When Olivia died in August of 2022 from breast cancer, Cliff posted one of the most heartbreaking tributes that anyone has ever published online. He wrote that death was a vicious enemy, and that all of us would be taken by it eventually. He wrote that he would only believe from now on that Olivia had simply stopped living somehow. He could not bring himself to use the word death about her at all. Then there is the strange Sue Barker story, which only gets messier and stranger the deeper you start to dig into it. Cliff has spent over 40 years telling television interviewers that he seriously thought about asking the tennis champion Sue Barker to marry him during the early 1980s, but that he realized in the end he did not love her enough to commit. Sue Barker herself has been telling a completely different version of events in her own published autobiography. She has said publicly that marriage was never even close to being on the cards between them. She has begged him in interview after interview to please stop bringing her name up. She wrote that on the day after her actual wedding to her real husband Lance Tankard in 1988, she had to wake up to a national newspaper headline that read, "Why I Couldn't Marry Sue by Cliff." She said that the romance had only lasted a few short months, and yet she has been hearing about it for over 40 long years. She wrote in her own book that an old boyfriend named Greg Norman had been far more important in her actual life. But it is this brief time with Cliff that still hangs around her neck like a permanent weight. So who is telling the actual truth here? Maybe both of them are, in their own quiet ways. Maybe Cliff genuinely remembered the relationship differently than she did. Or maybe the bachelor boy from his 1962 song needed those public proposals that never quite happened to keep his polished image safely in place. Either way, every single one of his rumored romances over the decades has ended in the exact same way, with him gently explaining why he could not commit. After a while, the pattern stops being a coincidence and starts to look much more like a quiet confession from a man who knew exactly what he was doing. If you think the questions about his secret private life ended right there with Sue and Olivia, you are in for a serious shock about who Cliff Richard has actually been sharing his daily home life with for the last 25 years. The companion nobody talks about. For decade after decade, the British tabloids hounded Cliff with constant questions about his sexuality. He gave them denials. He gave them annoyed quotes when they pushed too hard. He even gave them an entire chapter in his own autobiography when he had finally had enough. In 2008, he wrote in print that he was sick to death of the media's endless speculation about who he loved. And that one line still sums up how completely tired he had become of the whole circus by then. His companion is a man named John Mclynn. John is American by birth. John used to be a Roman Catholic priest in active ministry. They first met when Cliff was visiting New York in the year 2001. According to Cliff's own careful writing on the subject, John was already thinking about possibly leaving the priesthood when their paths first crossed, and Cliff suggested that he might come over and help with some of the charitable projects he was involved with. That casual arrangement slowly grew into something much deeper over time. John now spends most of his time managing all of Cliff's properties around the world. They share a beautiful house in the Algarve region of Portugal together. They share their daily life. Cliff has been remarkably open about why this arrangement matters so much to him personally. He wrote in his autobiography that he simply does not like living alone, even now in his older years. That one single sentence might genuinely be the most honest thing Cliff Richard has ever publicly said about himself. He does not like living alone, even now. The same man who walked away from a real relationship with Delia Wicks at 21 because his career mattered more to him. The same man who lost Olivia to another fiancée. The same man who told Sue Barker he could not commit. Finally admitted in his 60s that he never actually wanted to be by himself. He had found a companion who would manage his houses and share his quiet evenings, and he finally stopped pretending that he did not need anyone at all in this world. Cliff has insisted publicly more than once that he and John are not gay together. He has said clearly that what truly matters in life is commitment, and that he does not care what sexuality anyone identifies with as long as two people are committed to one another. He has even publicly called on the Church of England to bless same-sex commitments between consenting adults. Whatever the actual truth of his deeply private life behind closed doors, Cliff has now lived for well over 2 decades inside a quiet domestic arrangement that looks nothing at all like the public bachelor image he carefully built. The squeaky clean Christmas card icon was never quite the full picture that millions of fans imagined. And yet, the faith that ultimately shaped every single choice he ever made about love and companionship started on one specific night in 1966, when he stood before 25,000 people and made a personal promise that would go on to cost him almost everything. The night he chose God over everything else. On the 16th of June, 1966, Cliff Richard walked nervously onto a stage at Earl's Court in central London during a Billy Graham crusade and did something that nobody in the British music industry was expecting from him. He gripped a microphone tightly in his shaking hands, looked out at 25,000 young people staring back at him, and declared that he was proud to tell everyone in the room that he was now a Christian. Then he sang a gospel song called "It's No Secret" in front of all of them. When he was finished singing, he walked outside the building to talk with the thousands of teenagers who could not even fit into the hall. He was only 25 years old at the time. His pop career was at its absolute commercial peak, and he had just chosen a spiritual path that would slowly put a tall fence around the rest of his personal life. The conversion did not come out of nowhere like a bolt of lightning. His sister Joan had married into an evangelical Christian circle of friends, and her fiancé Graham introduced Cliff to a Bible study leader named Bill Latham at the time. Bill was a school teacher then. Bill would later go on to become Cliff's closest personal companion and manager for many decades. And Cliff actually lived with Bill and Bill's elderly mother in a quiet suburban house in Hertfordshire, long before John Mclynn ever came into the picture from New York. The faith that Cliff Richard embraced that night in the summer of 1966 was not just a passing hobby for him. It became the entire architecture of his personal life going forward. For quite a while after that famous night, he genuinely considered quitting music altogether to train properly as a religious education teacher in a regular school somewhere. His friends in the evangelical movement actually had to work hard to persuade him to stay in the entertainment industry so that he could use his fame to witness for his Christian faith. Just think about that decision for one moment. The biggest pop star in all of Britain almost walked completely away from his place in the spotlight to grade ordinary lesson papers in a school classroom somewhere. His Christian faith went on to shape absolutely everything that followed in his career. It shaped why he did not chase the wild rock and roll lifestyle that his American peers were busy living through during the 1960s. It shaped why his romantic relationships always seemed to end with calm explanations about commitment and personal convictions. It shaped why he quietly poured millions of pounds of his own earnings into international charities like Tear Fund over the long decades. And in the absolute cruelest twist of fate in his life, that very same faith is exactly why the 1985 Billy Graham crusade in Sheffield became the chosen setting for the false allegation that nearly destroyed him 3 decades later in a Berkshire apartment. The faith that gave his daily life all of its meaning is also what placed him at the scene of the accusation that broke his heart wide open. Very few stars in pop history have ever had to carry that kind of contradiction inside themselves. And so, we finally arrive at the very end of this strange and lonely story, where an 85-year-old man stands on a stage at the Royal Albert Hall, refusing point-blank to use the word retirement, while his aging body quietly tells him the truth he does not want to hear. The frail man with the voice that still works. In December of last year, Cliff Richard completed his UK tour, which he had named Can't Stop Me Now. The tour wrapped up with 2 final nights at the legendary Royal Albert Hall on the 8th and 9th of December. The defiant name of the tour sounded like a fighter refusing to leave the boxing ring for good. But the reviewers who actually attended those final nights came away with a much more complicated picture in their notebooks. One reviewer wrote in his column that he had arrived at the venue with some real worry because Cliff had looked frail in his recent television appearances. The very moment Cliff opened his mouth and started to sing on that stage, all of those worries simply disappeared into the warm theater air. The voice was still strong. The voice was still flawless and clear. The contrast between the trembling speaking voice in interviews and the powerful singing voice on a real stage was almost impossible for anyone in the audience to believe. Cliff has been extremely careful about the exact words he uses to describe what comes next in his life. He refuses to use the word retirement at all because he says it sounds far too final, like a heavy door being locked from the outside forever and the key thrown away. He much prefers the softer word stopping, because stopping simply means that he could change his mind tomorrow morning if he wanted to. He could pick up the telephone, ask his office to book the Royal Albert Hall for a couple more nights, and step back out to sing again if the hall was free on those dates. That careful distinction matters to him in a way that we might find quite hard to understand from the outside looking in. But for a man who has spent 67 full years of his life on a stage, the word retirement probably feels like a kind of small death to him. When a reporter asked him in July of last year whether his Australian tour would be a complete farewell to that country, he answered with brutal honesty straight from the heart. He said quietly that he simply did not know the answer. He said that he did not even think about that question anymore at his age. He said that as he gets older, he will probably become less and less able to perform live. But he refused to guess exactly when that final day would actually arrive for him. He admitted openly that touring is very wearing on his body now. that the travel and the hotels and the time zone changes take more out of him with every single flight he takes. He admitted that age has made his singing voice unpredictable in ways it never used to be before, which is a brand new and frightening anxiety for a man who never once had to worry about whether his voice would even show up for him on the night. So just think about him today, as he is right now in 2026. An 85-year-old man who has just beaten prostate cancer for the moment, but who refuses to use the word beaten. A man who never once married, never had any children of his own, never built the kind of warm family that fills a house with grandchildren at Christmas time. A man who sold his beloved Portuguese vineyard, called Adega do Cantor, in 2022 after 20 proud years of growing wine on that land in the Algarve. A man who also sold his Barbados villa, called Coral Sundown, after owning it for 23 sun-soaked years. A man who now lives very quietly with his companion John, splits his time between his Algarve house and his UK home in Berkshire, and quietly waits to see what his aging body will allow him to do next. He has sold over 250 million records around the world during his career. He has scored 68 top 10 singles in the UK charts. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth herself back in 1995, becoming the first pop star in the long history of Britain ever to receive that royal honor. He has changed British privacy law forever through a high court case that he never actually wanted to fight in the first place. He has lived a life that, by every measurable standard of fame and wealth and lasting achievement, has been one of the most successful careers in the entire history of British popular music. And yet, when you watch him slowly sit down in a television studio today and answer simple questions in that soft and frail voice of his, you simply cannot help but notice just how very alone he looks, sitting under all of those bright stage lights. The boy who was born in a hospital in Lucknow during the dying days of the British Empire, who crossed the wide ocean as a young child with just 5 pounds to his family's name, who lived for years on hot tea and sugar toast in a small council house in Cheshunt, who grew up to become the very first British rock star that anyone outside of Britain had ever even heard of, has finally arrived at his last chapter in life. He is still standing tall. His voice still works for him when he reaches for the high notes on a real stage. But the silence between the songs has grown much longer with each passing year, and the audiences in the venues can feel it in the air, and Cliff knows it deep down too. What do you think about how Cliff Richard is really living through his final years right now? Share your honest thoughts with us in the comments section below, and let us know whether you believe he should finally stop performing for good or keep going on for as long as that beautiful voice of his will allow him to sing.